Before this episode begins, we want to give you a trigger warning. We want you to know that the content of this episode speaks to pregnancy loss and miscarriages and/or a viable pregnancy. We understand this content may be triggering to some of you, and you may wish to save this episode for another day. Remember, your emotions are valid, and we encourage you to take care of yourself and reach out to reliable resources for support when you need them.
Then it just was something that I always kind of in the back of my mind thought if there's children that need love, nurture versus nature, that whole conversation, I would be happy to just, I have so much mom in me to give that it didn't matter necessarily that it was genetically going to look like me or, you know, be a mini me for me to be able to embrace being a parent. What I had to share and what I wanted to do was be a parent first and foremost. And whomever that little person is, I was going to love them and wrap my arms around them and tuck them in at night wholeheartedly. So I think it was just our two worlds coming together with different experiences that had opened our hearts to the idea of adoption for completely different reasons.
Hi, superhumans. I'm Dr. Mavis Garcia.
And I'm Dr. Wise.
We're two of the physician leaders at Markham Fertility Centre, otherwise known as Our Baby, MFC.
As fertility specialists, we've witnessed firsthand the challenges, triumphs, and the myriad of emotions that come with trying to conceive. Whether you're just starting to think about having a baby, actively trying, or facing challenges along the way, My Fertility Podcast will be your go-to resource for honest conversations and a supportive community.
So grab a cup of coffee or tea and settle in, and let's demystify the world of fertility together.
On today's episode, we are very pleased to have one of our former patients join us, Alison. Alison is a new mom at the age of 43. She gave birth to a very healthy baby boy that's currently sleeping. And this beautiful baby was conceived, and of course, beautiful in all our eyes, through IVF from 8 years prior with help across the country. Alison and her husband built their family through embryo donation. And so with the help of MFC and our wonderful donor surrogacy team here, we helped Alison become a mom. We're really excited today to talk about the embryo donation program, embryo donation in general, as I would venture to say that not many people even realize that it's an option or know that it exists. So, Alison, thank you so much for joining us. We're so excited to have you on today.
Thank you so much for being here. This is such an important topic. So I would like to ask you, tell us how you got to the point of using embryo adoption to build your family. What got you there?
Well, I have to say, and I'll preface that I was at the point in my fertility journey where I was ready for a stork to drop a baby on my doorstep. I was at that somebody please give me something to help me become a mother and for my husband and I to become parents. So our journey, I mean, I was already 39 when I met my husband. And so we right away started. We worked with another fertility team for a year and it was at COVID as well. So I had time to focus on this. We weren't getting anywhere. There was no traction. We did several IUIs. We didn't do IVF ourselves. And at the end of a year of working with this clinic, we thought, this kind of time and energy, why don't we focus our attention on adoption instead? It wasn't feeling right. We were feeling frustrated. I was feeling really frustrated with my body. And measuring your life in a 28-day cycle starts to feel defeating. And so, with our backstories, histories, just who we are as people, we decided that it was better to focus our time, effort, and financial resources looking at adoption. So that's what we did. We spent a lot of time and energy. And I don't say a lot of time as in calendar months, but we dove in headfirst, focusing on adoption. And what you don't find out about the adoption process is that a lot of the options or doors only open at certain times. And so, as we finally got in with one of the big agencies here in Ontario, this to us was like, oh my goodness, now we're going to get traction after doing all of the home inspections and background checks and counseling. And there's classes that you have to take after doing all of that and having our hearts open and thinking about adoption, when we signed on with one of these big agencies in their orientation program, they mention and talk about the fact that they have this embryo donation program. And for any couples that have a uterus, maybe you want to explore this as well. And that was like fireworks, mind-blowing moment happened. But we didn't know about it until then. We didn't know it was a possibility. So there we were, well on our way to working with adoption when we heard about embryo donation for the first time, and it seemed really possible.
And then after hearing about this option, how did you go about working on this option? How do you go about finding an agency and finding a clinic to work with?
We decided to go on referral because, as I mentioned, I had worked with a fertility team before, and it didn't leave me feeling very positive. So we asked the adoption agency who and what fertility teams had they worked with that embraced this idea, because this is also kind of leading edge, if you will. They have done this for 13, 14 years, but for most of us, it's not something openly discussed or commonly talked about. So I wanted to make sure that I found a team that was very open to the idea of working with me at my advanced stage, and that was really going to embrace and welcome a donated embryo, because that was really important for me. The beginnings team referred us to MFC, and we never looked back.
And that's where the start of our journey together was.
Yeah.
I have to admit that when you first came to see me, you already had a very clear plan in mind, in the sense that you're like, I am interested in adopting an embryo. I've started taking those steps. And basically said, will you help me? I didn't really know much about the program myself. And so I had to go back and do quite a bit of research. And I have to admit that when I have been counseling patients up until that point, embryo adoption was not something maybe that was in my routine counseling when we talk about donor egg or donor sperm or anything like that. So thank you so much for educating me as well and making me a better physician, to be honest.
Well, I think we've learned together through this.
Yeah. And so can you tell us a little bit about the process in terms of the logistics of how it went through? And then can you share some timelines as well? Because I think that that's always such, as you mentioned, timing in every cycle is like a lifetime, right? And so timelines are probably the number one question that we get.
Absolutely. I think the way that this all came to be, because we had been focusing our attention on building our family through adoption, we had already crossed a few hurdles that just accelerated the process for us on the embryo side. So, like I mentioned, we learned of this through an adoption agency that we had already been taken on as a family. But what is possible, and I've learned since, that there's a whole separate wing. So this agency also has Canada's first open embryo donation program. And I definitely want to mention the open part because I think that is important for people to know and understand. But for just talking about the timelines and how this all fell into place, we were already with them as a family that they had accepted and wanted to work with. So we had already kind of done a home study. We had already done classroom training on the idea of openness and families being built through non-biological options. And it was that element that I think got us ready a little faster than if someone's starting from square one. At that point, that would have been November, and we met. You did some testing on myself, like just to make sure that everything was functioning. I can't recall if it was yourself, Dr. Weiss, or if it was Stephanie, but somebody said a uterus is a uterus is a uterus. 27, 37, 47, the uterus, if it's going to work for us, we're not as worried about time. And so we did some cycle monitoring. We got me ready with the prescribed drugs and such, and we had me pregnant by March 14th. So within 6 months of learning about this program.
Wow,
Yeah,
that's fast.
that is fast.
in the fertility world.
Well, it's fast it blew everybody's mind. It was fast in the sense that we had already done those social pieces to the program because it does take a little time to meet with the counselors and make sure that you understand and are emotionally ready for this step. Because when people are talking about donation, you think of sperm donation, and it's probably going to be hush, hush, quiet. You'll bring it up at some point. Don't know how, don't know when, maybe not telling your family and friends. And this is kind of the opposite. We're signing up saying, we'll talk about this and our donors will be known in some fashion to our child. And that's from the adoption side of it, the understanding of the well being of that person years down the road, so that there's no secrecy, so that there's no surprises. It doesn't necessarily mean that we have a tight relationship with our donor, but there is awareness and there is some commitment back and forth to knowing about milestones, birthdays, general health, keeping in touch. So that's a big part of this. It starts at the beginning, and then you kind of have to get through that before you can then look at the shipping embryos across the country, working with different teams, fertility on the donor side as well as on the recipient side. So that's why it's, I think, a little shocking to everyone that we did this in 6 months.
And I can see what you're saying, that the reason it was quick, because the hardest part, I think, is going from I want to conceive with my own eggs to my own sperm to I'm now going to grieve that and leave all that behind and get into this option. And by the time that you heard about embryo adoption, you were already okay with adoption. So you have done all of that mental work ahead of time. And it was a question of like, okay, let's just check, check, check and do the thing. But how do you go from I want to be parents with my own eggs and my husband's sperm to I'm okay with not sharing the genetics and of course sharing all the love?
Well, my husband and I, like I said, we didn't meet until we were a little bit older. So I was 39, he was 40. He came from a family where his dad was not biologically his father, and he actually didn't know his biological father. So he had an element of just like deep seated awareness that you don't have to be genetically related to love a family member, right? Just like you don't have to be genetically related to love your spouse, that same kind of
Mhm.
understanding that for him, he didn't need that piece to feel like a child was his. I myself had gone through a life journey that at one point, my partner, Filipino, and myself being white, I knew that if I had have had a child at that point with that partner, my child probably wouldn't look very much like me. And so there had been that little tidbit of information, like that little piece way back that I had done a lot of thinking about. And then it just was something that I always kind of in the back of my mind thought if there's children that need love, nurture versus nature, that whole conversation, I would be happy to I have so much mom in me to give that it didn't matter necessarily that it was genetically going to look like me or, you know, um, be a mini me for me to be able to embrace being a parent. What I had to share and what I wanted to do was be a parent first and foremost. And whomever that little person is, I was going to love them and wrap my arms around them and tuck them in at night wholeheartedly. So I think it was just our two worlds coming together with different experiences that had opened our hearts to the idea of adoption for completely different reasons. And I also have to say, my brother, he and I are both 100% genetic siblings. We look nothing alike. We don't have any of the same mannerisms or skill sets. You would not know that we were siblings if you just met us on the street. So, how much weight did I really want to put into worrying about it being my egg or my husband's sperm? And I'll also say one other piece. If we were going to be going down the road of needing donation at all, I think it felt better for me for it to be an even playing field. Instead of having donor from one side, leaving the other parent to maybe feel like it wasn't quite even. And not that life is always even or equal, but it just felt right for us. Instead of spending a lot of time and energy worrying about which one of us was causing this challenge with the fertility, then let's just cut that piece out.
I think that's a beautiful answer, by the way. And I think you hit on so many important points. I'm so excited for other people to hear this, right? Because I think we see patients every day who are struggling with kind of making that decision moving forward, potentially with donor egg or donor sperm, let's say. And I think that answer just perfectly encapsulates the spirit. And I'm so excited for people to hear that. Let's take a second, and I'd love to go back to this concept of open adoption, which you kind of alluded to before. I think it's really important that we talk about it and explain what that means, because fertility patients may not necessarily understand the nuances. Can you tell us about that?
So, openness is the commitment to having awareness. The degree in which that relationship might exist can vary so much. When you're talking about adoption in the traditional sense of the word, it does mean that there's some kind of contact, maybe emails or photos, cards. Maybe there's even an agreement at the time of adoption that you're talking about visitation, maybe quarterly or annually, that there's some kind of physical meetup. When you apply that to the embryo donation side of things, first of all, this program is a mutual match. So we looked at, I think it was 13 families at the time had signed up to be donor families. We looked at 13 different profiles and we submitted our choices. Those donor families also looked at the recipient hopeful families and were able to mutually choose. So there's already this piece of respect, awareness. The donor families have also themselves been through IVF. That's how these embryos are available. So they've gone through that heartbreak, they've gone through that challenge, they have that awareness of what you're struggling with right now. Those families are currently up to their eyeballs in diapers or chasing toddlers around. By the time they come to this and are looking to find recipients, they have their hands full and they have a family, and their check boxes are maybe different than what you would assume in what you're looking for someone to be your recipient family of these embryos. And for the openness element, kind of at first it's scary. Does this mean they're going to weigh in? What if my kid wants to know them more or love them more or thinks they're cooler than I am, right? But the surprise factor, the curiosity, the shock of, I always think of teenage angst, right? Like being a teenager is hard enough. Having any kind of surprise or curiosity in those years is the hardest part. So if you take all of that away and that there's awareness, so openness meaning there's pictures that have been shared. There's maybe for us, it would be a FaceTime because they're on the other side of the country. So it's not necessarily a face-to-face meetup, but there's an awareness and that openness for our child to know that they came to our family through double the amount of love. There was embryos at the end of our donors' experience that they wanted to give an opportunity to another family to experience being parents. Then we come into having that love to share. So double the love given to this embryo that was then donated to us. And it's not a story of loss or grief. It's a story of giving and kindness. The openness will be talked about in our family from the beginning, and the names of our donors used in our family. We refer to our donor first name basis. And so our child will know that we are mommy and daddy, but the egg and the sperm weren't possible. So we accepted this embryo, this egg and sperm put together so that we could have our family.
Oh, I love that so much. That is so
I
beautiful.
think it's a long-winded way of explaining openness, but it's varying for every family. And for every recipient family, they might have different elements that are important to talk about with their child. So I can't speak for everybody to say what exactly openness looks like, but it's a commitment to some form of awareness mutually.
That is so well said. And I know from having been in this field of fertility care for about 11 years now, there are so many stories about people where openness wasn't done. And now they're adults and they're struggling with, I love my family, but I want to know where the egg and the sperm came from that made me. And that can be really difficult for adults to struggle with when they don't have access to that information. I think it's great that you do have the access and that from the very beginning of your child's life, they know that their story is special and unique. And like you said, double the love. There were two families that loved this little embryo and now this baby. And that's very, very special. And you're right. That's not something that as a teenager or as an adult, they're going to have to struggle with.
Well, and I think it's going to be very obvious. Now, our child, we ended up for our selection, we chose a donor. It was funny. My husband and I both came together. We both chose our top three. Like I said, we had 13 families to review. We each went away, read these bios, and came back with our top three so that we were only potentially discussing six, right? We weren't going to debate all 13 families. We tried to narrow it down. And we came back with our top three, and they were in different orders, but they were the same top three. So that made our discussion
Wow.
just that much easier. And
Mhm.
part of what came to be was that for us, the number of embryos, because you don't just deal in an embryo, it's a cluster. It's what is left over from their IVF experience. It could range anywhere from 2 to 8. And one of the families that we saw, they had 6, but they wanted it to go in 2 batches of 3 to recipient families. Our choice was someone who had 5 because I was 43 and there was no guarantee that first transfer was going to work. We knew that our donor had taken a few times to be able to build their family. So why would I assume that first would work for us? Now, when you work with a team like MFC that put the best practices in play first time round, we did. One and done. First transfer. It took. Miracle. And that's part of why 6 months later we were pregnant. But the profiles that you look at, it's sometimes the question of quantity. How many chances do you want to have to try this? Because there's no guarantee that the first transfer is going to work. You might need another, and you don't want to go through this mutual match over and over and over again if you can avoid it. So one of our decisions was choosing someone who had multiple, but they also, their lineage, their heritage was a mashup of my husband's and mine. So even though our little boy, has blue eyes like his dad, that might change, but at this point, he's going to be really tall, and neither my husband and I are tall. Like by the time he's 5, he'll be reaching for something off the top shelf for us. That's kind of this reality that he's a cute little boy that will grow into a very tall boy very quickly. Yeah.
So, what would you say to patients who are just considering this option at the very start? So, let's say they're not like you who've done, the home studies and everything. When they come to the beginning, they're sitting in their doctor's office and the doctor have said something like, there's donor eggs, there's donor sperm. This is what the journey looks like for donor eggs. Usually for women who are older, like you're right, the physician would say donor eggs would be the option, your partner's sperm. And I don't know if you had the donor egg conversation, but it's expensive and complicated and all the things. And the doctor might say, and there is another option, and it's called embryo adoption. And it's like you, like, what are you talking about? So, what would you say to somebody who's just heard this from the first time and started to consider it?
I think the very first thing that I would say to someone is check yourself. When you do things for the right reason, it's always going to work out. So check yourself and say, what is my motive for being a parent or a mom, right? What is it that you are looking for? And if it's to have a child and to experience that transformation that happens when you become a parent, because it is kind of life changing. Like people warn you about it and tell you that it's going to be different once they're here. It is. And you become a different version of yourself. So if your goal is really to become a parent, not necessarily to have a mini you, not necessarily to have that to your spouse that tethers you with that genetic mini you. If your motive is to be a parent, then I would say the first thing you have to do is reach out to, here in Canada, it's Beginnings Embryo Donation Program, and to find out when they're doing their next information session, because that's going to help, in better words than I can put it all together, give kind of some of the reality checks about the financial side of it, about the medical side of it, and then about the timelines at this point, because I can't speak for how the program is doing. Like, there might be a wait list. It might have taken off in the last year and a half. Who knows? There's a wait list to get in. But I think the first thing you have to ask yourself is your motives to become a parent. And if it isn't to have that genetic mini you or mini spouse, to really consider it. And I'm going to share this one piece that I was really shocked when I saw it in a slide for the orientation program for the embryo donation. It said the affordable adoption option. Now that's just catchy and fun to say, but when you talk about the financial reality of dealing with fertility, the fact that this is a donated embryo, the medical expenses you're paying for are the recipient side. It does cut out a lot of the cost as well. The egg retrieval, that whole front end of the IVF experience is kind of taken out of the equation. So that's something to consider as well, because a lot of times when people are looking at egg and sperm, they're looking at purchasing from the States. They're going down dozens of dollars spent to purchase from another source. And in this case, there's a piece. I'm not saying it's cheap. This isn't just, throw the financial concerns out the window, but it does eliminate some of that stress. Then I think a big part of it as well for any of the women who want to carry, like, that was one piece that I kind of mourned when you talk about the mourning of the experience of having a child yourself. I was kind of sad thinking, I'm not going to get to be pregnant. I'm not going to get to breastfeed. And with this, I did. I got to experience all of that. That's amazing.
I hope that a lot of people that are listening today are also going to consider potentially donating their embryos as well. Because I think on the flip side, for patients who have gone through IVF and have completed their families, completed their journeys, I don't know if they necessarily know that donating their embryos is a potential option. I think even less so, because they're probably not connected into the fertility community as much as a fertility patient, and they're not still seeing their fertility doctors once they've completed their families. And so I really hope that this story, this episode, inspires people to at least think about it. I mean, it's not for everyone, but it is always better to have options and considerations, and that, this could be a way to pass on the love and share the love and see it blossom, right, in forms of their embryos.
Yeah, it's kind of incredible when you think about how many thousands are even just in our province, or even just in our, like, not even nationally, but just here in Ontario where we are. Think of how many families are sitting there with their embryos after building their families and saying, what on earth do I do with this? I'm not just going to pay storage indefinitely. And maybe some are, because they just can't make that decision. And I definitely also understand that I have friends that couldn't imagine a biological offspring out there in the world and not having any kind of control over their upbringing or what life they live. But it's a very big picture, selfless act to give those embryos an opportunity, and families that opportunity to actually have a child. And like I said, for me to be able to carry and to have a pregnancy and go through delivery and learning how to breastfeed, all of those life dreams were able to come from somebody else being generous and thinking about the opportunity that this could bring for not only our child, but my husband and myself to be able to be parents.
Thing that I think is great about your story is a lot of time people come to embryo adoption after having done multiple IVF cycles, using all kinds of combinations, 10-year fertility journey. And I want everybody listening to know that you don't have to do all of the things. Like you did a couple of IUIs that didn't work and decided this was your best option. There might be somebody who doesn't do any fertility at all. They just right off the bat saying, I don't want to go through a fertility journey myself and I want to look at this option right away. So I think it's important to know that, yeah, most people, a lot of people, I say, want to have a journey and have an opportunity. And by the time they come here, they've done so many other things, but it doesn't always have to be the case.
Yeah. And I think also it's kind of interesting to, in hindsight, look back and say, well, my husband and I, we didn't want to have that IVF experience. I didn't, I didn't want to have that IVF experience myself. Now, part of that was my age. At the time that we decided to do this, I thought, what are our chances? How many different retrieval cycles are we going to need to look at to get good, healthy eggs that we can work with? But I also hadn't wanted to dive into that level of fertility help at that point. Now, had I listened to your episode with Dr. Amy 10 years ago, it would have been a completely different journey. But the way that this played out for us, like we kind of jumped in halfway through and it wasn't nearly as scary.
Well, the way that I think about fertility is about options, right? I want my patients to know they have the option to do nothing and be childless by choice. And that's perfectly okay. And their life can be big and wonderful and worth it, even if they choose not to do anything. I want them to know they can do IVF even if they're 43. Yes, the odds, you're right. It would have taken multiple cycles and it would have been very expensive and all the things, but that's a choice that they get to make for themselves as well. And then there is the options of donor eggs and donor sperm and embryo adoption as well. So I think this journey is so unique. And I've been doing this for 11 years. I probably have seen by now, I don't know, thousands and thousands and thousands of patients, same-sex couples, male, female, all kinds of combinations. And there isn't one story that is the same. They all have their special uniqueness to it. So I think this is why I wanted to highlight that you didn't go through all the long journey before coming to this option, because this option is there for anybody who is interested, and every journey looks a little different and everybody comes into it bringing their own special sauce to it, and it's all about options. It is all about having options, and that's something that I hold very close to my heart when I counsel my patients. It's like, what do you want? Where are you on your journey? What's going to make you feel heard and whole and present, and that this journey is yours and not being imposed on you by somebody else, i.e. your fertility doctor.
I think that's absolutely 100% correct. Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'm not going to recapitulate everything Dr. Garcia just said so well, because there's no way I could do it better. But I think that this is why we were so keen to have you on the podcast relatively early, because this is something that I think people need to hear about. Again, both on the side of people who might be considering embryo adoption and on the side of people who have extra embryos and are not quite sure what to do with them, so they hear their options. And we want to use this podcast to sort of explore the so broad range of different ways to pursue that journey and to go on that journey.
Yeah. Well, and it is funny now. I find myself in the flip side. Now we have 4 embryos. So we are now in the position of having to decide what happens next for those 4 embryos.
Very true. That's going to be an interesting part 2 to your journey. We have to bring you back on the podcast once we know what happens there.
Yeah. Well, it'll be interesting as our relationship grows with our donor. We really respect our donor and we very much are linked through social media. We haven't done a FaceTime introduction yet, but at the same time, like we have adult to adult communication here and there. There is going to be this evolution of our relationship and see how that goes. We're all just busy with our families individually, right? So there's not that much curiosity. Our little one is still learning what his toes are. So we're not curious about where those toes came from or whose feet he has. But yeah, we're just learning that toes can go in mouth right now. So talk to me in 10 years when we're trying to figure out his shoe size and why it's so different than ours.
Thank you so much, Alison, for coming on our podcast and being so open with your journey. I hope that inspires so many others.
My pleasure. And like I said, I'm just so excited to see this opportunity, this choice out there, and for something that I didn't know about 3 years ago to have now been how we built our family. I'm happy to talk about it.
Thank you so much, Alison. And I'm so excited for you and your little one. And I look forward to getting updates periodically. I'm curious how tall your son will be. But honestly, thanks so much for sharing your story. I just want to tell a little snippet. So you actually reached out to us before anyone even knew that this podcast existed. If you recall, when baby was born, you reached out by email and said, hey, if anyone is ever interested in hearing about embryo adoption, if you're ever going to talk about it, I want to share. And I think you said, I want to be the poster family for this. And so it was really funny because nobody knew that Dr. Garcia and I at that time were going to do a podcast. And then we just looked at each other. We're like, yes, this is going to be one of our key episodes. I think when we were contemplating guests for our podcast, I think it was like Dr. Chan. I think you were second on our list because you approached us, and that was just so wonderful. And so thank you so much for coming and for sharing your story and such personal feelings. I have no doubt that there's going to be people who are going to be listening to this who are going to now consider embryo adoption and who may consider using their embryos and putting them up for adoption in a similar situation. And I think that's a really beautiful thing that you've inspired lots of people today.
Oh, yeah. And I think it's okay to also say there's going to be a lot of people that listen to this and say, absolutely not.
And that's okay too.
Totally.
Exactly.
And that's a wrap for today, Superhumans.
If you're looking to connect, get social with us. Follow us on YouTube and Instagram at My Fertility Podcast or visit us online at markhamfertility.com. And don't forget, follow, subscribe, and share your favorite episode.
Thanks for listening to My Fertility Podcast and for being a vital part of our community. We know you've got this.
We're signing off until next Tuesday.
If you found this episode of My Fertility Podcast helpful, please take a moment to head over to the review section and leave us your thoughts. Your reviews and comments are incredibly valuable to us and help guide future episodes. We also welcome you to direct your questions to info@myfertilitypodcast.com.
My Fertility Podcast is produced by Rabbit Media Inc. in conjunction with Dr. Garcia and Dr. Weiss. Music from Mix Kit Raising Me Higher by Ajay Stelino. My Fertility Podcast is not intended to replace any type or variation thereof professional medical, health, or legal advice, nor should the content be taken as medical advice. Please contact your primary healthcare professional regarding any medical questions you may have. The information presented in this podcast is based on the knowledge and understanding of the host at the time of recording. Medical knowledge is constantly evolving, and new research may change the understanding of health-related topics. While we strive to provide accurate and up-to-date information, we do not guarantee the completeness, accuracy, or timeliness of the content. The views expressed in this podcast by guests are not those of the host or the management. This podcast is not intended to impose any type of discrimination. My Fertility Podcast and its management are not responsible for any losses, damages, or liabilities that may arise from the use of this podcast.